Somewhere in the back alleys of Saigon's Cholon district, a young American soldier hands a Vietnamese tailor a fistful of piastres and his own set of regulation fatigues, and asks her to copy a pattern she's never made for a foreigner before. Not olive green, not the plain, flat color the United States Army issued to every man who stepped off the plane at Tan Son Nhut. He wants stripes. Black, dark green, and khaki, bleeding into each other like shadows in wet foliage. He is not authorized to wear this uniform. No supply sergeant in the U.S. Army can order it for him. If a stateside inspector saw him in it, he could be written up for a uniform violation in a war zone. He buys it anyway, folds it into his rucksack, and wears it into the jungle the next morning, because the uniform the Army gave him was, in his own quiet judgment, going to get him killed. This is the file on tiger stripe, the most famous camouflage pattern of the Vietnam War. And the U.S. military never actually issued it. Over the next 20 minutes, we'll get into why American soldiers went to war in plain green cloth, with no camouflage pattern at all, where the tiger stripe design actually came from, how it crossed from Vietnamese allies to American special forces through a supply chain that ran entirely outside regulation channels, and how a pattern with no official U.S. stock number became one of the most recognized and most copied uniforms in military history. Quick favor before we get into the tailor shops of Saigon. If this kind of history is your thing, a like and a subscribe go a long way. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Start with the uniform the Army actually issued, because the absence is the whole story. By the mid-1960s, the standard fatigue uniform for American ground troops in Vietnam was the OG-107, a flat, solid olive green cotton sateen, no pattern, no camouflage of any kind. This was not an oversight. It was the settled doctrine of a peacetime army that had, if anything, grown more cautious about camouflage patterns since the last war, not less. In the Pacific during World War II, the Marine Corps had fielded a reversible camouflage uniform, green and brown on one side, tan on the other, nicknamed frog skin. It worked. It also got pulled from general issue, in part because its blotchy, foreign-looking pattern led to cases of Marines being misidentified as Japanese troops by their own side in the chaos of jungle fighting. That single ugly lesson, camouflage causing friendly fire through misidentification, sat in institutional memory for 2 decades. When the Army built its supply pipeline for Vietnam, it defaulted to the safest possible choice, a uniform that could never be mistaken for the enemy's, because it looked like nothing in nature at all. It was cheap to mass produce, easy to dye in bulk, and utterly uniform down the supply chain. It was also, in the terrain the infantry actually fought in, close to useless as camouflage. While the American Army stood still on the question, its ally down the supply chain solved it. The tiger stripe pattern did not originate with the United States. It descended from a French design, the tenue léopard, or lizard pattern, developed by French colonial forces during the First Indochina War in the years before Dien Bien Phu, a mottled scheme of greens, browns, and black meant to break up a man's outline in the same dense, low, broken light vegetation that would later swallow American patrols. When the French left and the country split, the pattern didn't disappear. It passed into the hands of the force that inherited both French training and French leftover cloth, the emerging military of South Vietnam. Vietnamese Marine Corps units and the Vietnamese Ranger and Special Forces formations known as the LLDB took the old French concept and remade it entirely by hand, through local tailors working treadle sewing machines in shops with no central pattern book, no single authorized template, and no 2 shops producing quite the same result. That absence of standardization, which would later drive militaria historians half mad trying to catalog every regional variant, was in the field an advantage. Every batch was slightly different, which meant no enemy sniper could learn to recognize one single silhouette. American advisors serving alongside those Vietnamese units in the early and mid-1960s. The Special Forces men embedded with LLDB Rangers. The Marine advisors working with the Vietnamese Marine Corps saw the pattern up close before most of their own countrymen had ever set foot in the country. They saw it disappear into the brush in a way their own flat olive green never did. And they wanted it, not as a fashion statement, as a survival tool. And the men closest to the actual killing understood that distinction better than anyone sitting behind a desk drawing up uniform regulations. Here is where the story stops being about cloth and starts being about how an army actually adapts faster than its own bureaucracy. Because there was no legal way for an American soldier to be issued Tiger Stripe. It had no U.S. national stock number. No American quartermaster could order a crate of it from a domestic contractor. So the men who wanted it built their own supply chain, one built entirely on cash, trust, and a foreign tailor's needle. Special Forces soldiers working alongside Vietnamese counterparts would bring a set of their own uniforms into a shop in Saigon, in Nha Trang, in Da Nang, and pay a local tailor, often a woman running a small family operation, to copy the tiger stripe pattern onto American-cut fatigues, sized and tailored to fit an individual man's body in a way standard issue never was. Some units placed larger informal orders, buying enough sets for a whole team at once, paid for out of unit funds or simply out of pocket, invoiced nowhere, tracked by no supply officer. Navy SEAL platoons, Marine Force reconnaissance teams, and above all the men of MACV-SOG, running cross-border reconnaissance into Laos and Cambodia, became the pattern's most devoted customers. For men whose entire operational doctrine depended on not being seen until it was too late, a locally tailored, non-standard, endlessly variable camouflage was not a luxury. It was mission equipment that the supply system simply refused to provide. This put those men in a strange position, technically breaking uniform regulations that required American forces to wear standard-issue OG-107 fatigues, while their own commanders, in many cases, looked the other way, because everyone from the team leader up understood that the man in tiger stripe was more likely to come home. There's a second layer to why SOG in particular embraced it so completely, and it connects to something else about those teams. Recon men crossing into Laos and Cambodia already stripped themselves of anything that read as American, sanitizing their gear, carrying no dog tags, no letters, nothing that confirmed a nationality if the mission went wrong. A uniform with no U.S. stock number, copied from an Allied pattern sourced through a Vietnamese tailor, fit that same logic perfectly. It was one more piece of a man's kit that didn't announce where he came from. The Army was not entirely blind to the problem. Buried in its own research pipeline sat a pattern developed years earlier by the Engineer Research and Development Laboratories, a four-color leaf design conceived around 1948 in the aftermath of the Second World War's own camouflage lessons. That ERDL pattern existed on paper and in limited test runs for nearly 2 decades before Vietnam gave it any real purpose. When the Army finally began issuing it in useful quantities, starting with priority given to Special Forces in the later years of the war, it was already competing against a rival that soldiers had chosen for themselves and had grown to trust. Some men switched to the official leaf pattern once it became available. A great many didn't, because the tiger stripe they'd had personally tailored fit them, had already been proven in the field, and in more than a few cases had simply become a matter of identity, a visible marker of which units had earned the right to look different from the conventional army around them. Picture the scene the way it actually happened for one man. You are a Green Beret sergeant on your second tour, standing in a cramped tailor's shop off a side street in Nha Trang, the smell of dye and machine oil in the air, a single ceiling fan turning overhead. You've laid your old fatigues on the counter as a sizing template. The woman running the shop has made a dozen sets like this before, for a dozen other Americans who found their way here through word of mouth, one advisor telling another where to go, the same way men pass down which resupply items to hoard. You pay her in cash you were never reimbursed for and never will be. 3 days later, you pick up a uniform with no serial number, no supply tag, nothing that exists on any Army ledger anywhere. You wear it out to the wire that night, and in the tree line at dusk, for the first time since you arrived in this country, you watch your own point man simply vanish into the brush 10 meters ahead of you, exactly the way you needed him to. That quiet, personal decision, made in tailor shops from Saigon to Da Nang by thousands of men, one uniform at a time, spread the way everything real in that war spread, sideways, unit to unit, never handed down from a headquarters memo. And it left a mark far outside the war itself. Tiger stripe became, after Vietnam, one of the most recognized and most reproduced camouflage patterns on Earth, copied by militaries and manufacturers around the world long after the war that made it famous had ended, collected today by militaria historians who still argue over how many distinct regional variants actually existed, because no single authority ever wrote the pattern down. The modern American military's own camouflage lineage, the leaf pattern woodlands and multi-terrain systems that followed, traced their conceptual roots back to that same era, when the Army finally accepted what a handful of soldiers in a Saigon tailor shop had already figured out years earlier, that a uniform's only real job is to make a man harder to kill. And if the regulation book couldn't keep up with that fact, the men in the field would simply solve it themselves and pay for it out of their own pockets. If you or someone you served with ever had a set of tiger stripe made off the books, bought it in a market stall, or remembers the first time you saw a teammate disappear into the tree line wearing something the Army never gave him, that story belongs in the record. Leave it in the comments. If this earned it, leave a like. It genuinely decides how many people this reaches. Share this video, because the real history of this war is written as much in tailor shops and supply workarounds as it is in battles. And subscribe for more of the equipment stories they didn't put in the manuals. To the tailors of Saigon, who never knew whose lives their needlework would save, and to the men who paid for their own camouflage because the war couldn't wait for the regulation book to catch up. This one was for you.